Mr. Chair.
Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Put simply, the problem that we were supposed to address with this bill was a lack of funding. That was the issue that came up again and again at Select Committee. It was an issue that officials acknowledged was significant in the setting of standards and so on. It was a question that was legitimate to ask, but what we got and what we have with this bill is the answer to another question. The answer to the question of what structure would make it look like we were doing something without addressing the real issue, the real funding issue. And that's what we've got here in this bill. We have the answer to a different question, to a problem that may not even have existed in the first place. And we've heard members opposite defensively saying that just because you bring an organisation inside another organisation doesn't mean it loses its independence. That was the argument we've just heard from opposite. We didn't hear why you should bring it inside another organisation. We just heard that somehow when you bring in one organisation under the purview of another, it doesn't hamper its independence. Well, I think that man, to paraphrase someone else, doth protest too much. And I think that here we are in this chamber debating a few sideshows when we start talking about, when we avoid the real issue of funding that sits at the basis of the future of good standards and accreditation in this country. Many of the submitters that we had in front of us in Select Committee expressed concern about risks from the change in the model. And of course there were the concerns about being within MB, and we know from recent weeks that the culture that the Minister is setting within MB may not be in the interests of many business people in this country. And I refer of course to the details that have come up about the expensive $70,000 sign out the front and so on. Mr. Chair, this is germane to my argument, and I will come back to it, but I will try and make it clear so that I don't stray too far from the bill. This is about whether that department is independent enough and acting in the interests of those for whom it is supposed to be serving, or not. And it is clear that the Minister has set a tone for that department which is about the interests of the big end of town. It is about $260,000 sun decks. It is about $140,000 TV screens. And it is about $76,000 reception desks. The Minister has sent a message that he is concerned with the big end of town. And those who would have standards and accreditations granted that are relevant and interesting for New Zealand businesses are concerned are often smaller businesses, those who are trying to grow in the economy, those who are trying to diversify our economy, that which is desperately needed in an economy that is under threat from being too commodity focused, from not having enough diversity, not having enough other industries to share the burden of growing our economy, and leaves it all to the primary sector. And so we do need businesses to be thriving. And part of what we learnt in Select Committee, part of what those who came in and gave of their time and wisdom, those who are involved in the standards and accreditations process, said to us was that actually one of the most important things is that we have representation in international fora where international accreditation and standards are agreed. And when those standards are agreed, they can be agreed in the interests of some countries or in the interests of other countries, naturally enough. And so the examples, I think in the earlier stages of the debate, one example that was brought up was a power switch, you know, that a simple power switch in the wall that you plug your phone into, or you charge your heater with, you plug your heater in, charge your phone, could be set to be an international standard at some stage in the future. And if there is a debate about that, who stands to gain from a particular standard that's set? It is probably the country and the manufacturers in the country that win the battle about what the standard or accreditation should look like. The ones who have the existing patents and the existing abilities and structure and so on to manufacture those devices in that particular way. New Zealand up until now has enjoyed a particularly good international reputation by virtue of having many hard-working people who have served on international committees to ensure that New Zealand standards are a part of that debate. so that New Zealand industries can compete in the international market, because the standards are of an international, set in a way that New Zealand businesses can compete in, Mr. Chair.
Dr. David.
Mr. Chair, so it does seem important that we continue to have that international representation in the standards and accreditation setting process. And in the Select Committee, when these concerns were raised, I have to say that I was not comforted that in the new model there would be sufficient emphasis placed on maintaining those international connections, on having that strong international voice in that standard setting process. It was something that came up again and again, and it seemed that the focus had shifted. The focus had shifted, and it was more about efficiency gains within the ministry and so on. And the previous speaker brought to our attention this idea that they should be acting independently. Well, I would like to read from a couple of paragraphs further down in the same Act, the one we're debating, in Part 1 here, Clause 8, or Section 8, Clause 1, which says the New Zealand Standards Executive may delegate to any employee in the ministry any of his or her powers or the performance of his or her functions or duties under this Act or any other enactment. Now, I want to ask how that would work in practice. And what we see there is a ministry, which we already know, I think, is under the micromanagement of Stephen Joyce, who chooses the colours and layouts of the documents he prints. We have officials there who, of course, want to keep their minister happy, but are likely to have delegated tasks which include carrying out functions that the minister would like to see in the standards and accreditations. That statutory independence is not as easy to guarantee when you have the employees of a ministry as a subset of the ministry carrying out these tasks rather than a truly independent industry-led body. And so, Mr. Chair, I think that this is a legitimate concern to raise, and it is one that was raised again and again and again by people in industry, those people who have been involved in the standards and accreditation setting process up till now. And members opposite may say that they know better, than those who are involved in standards and accreditation setting up to now. Those who are involved in the industry, those who have served it over decades, some of them that came to speak to us. But I would say to them that if they think that they know better and don't even have to take those considerations into account, then they are showing just how out of touch they have become on that side of the house. And that is what we see here. And once again, also, we see here something that was designed as a cost-cutting measure as well, without eye to the bigger picture, without saying, how does this reflect upon us in the international setting? How does this forward our international interests? How does this grow our exports? We know that MB is not meeting the government's target of achieving 40% of our exports, 40% of our GDP as exports. In fact, under Minister Joyce, it started around 33%, it's now down around 27%, and it's projected to drop further. I would suggest it's not the ministry that's at fault, it's the micromanaging minister who has this program going on, then wants to select the pamphlet colour, then wants to turn the document around, then wants to reword his own text. And my heart goes out to the officials who have to work with that minister, who is proving to be ineffective, but is also chasing things down the wrong track. Here we have an example where we've had plenty of advice from the public, plenty of advice from experts that we should do things a certain way, but the government has blocked its ears and says, we know better, we're going to do it our way, and bother the public and those pesky people who work in the industry. So, Mr. Chair, my submission is that what we have here is the answer to a problem that doesn't really exist. The problem is around funding. It wasn't with the structure. That's what we heard from submitters. And in fact, we have additional risks within the new structure. One of the points I haven't raised yet is that there is no worker or consumer representation in the new structure. Again, something raised repetitively by submitters and given no convincing response from officials. And I again, my heart went out to the officials because one could see they had their writing instructions. They were given a clear picture of how things should be, and it was very difficult to come up with legitimate explanations as to why it should be that way. So this is a bill that we will oppose. We do value input from the industry. We value having New Zealand on the international stage, setting those standards, helping to shape the future of the world markets, those markets that we want to be competitive in. Goodness knows under this government, exports are plummeting as a portion of GDP. We need it to be going in the opposite direction, and we believe we actually need to get alongside industry instead of always knowing better than industry. I don't know why they hate business on that side of the house, but they seem to persist with telling them they're wrong.